Welcome to Life Empowers with Melissa Ohden. Where there is life, there is hope. Where there is life, there's a place for love to grow, and love emboldens and strengthens. Where there is life, there's an opportunity to grow and be empowered. I'm living testament to that, and you are too. And if you don't yet feel like your life is testament to this, don't despair and don't stop listening to this podcast. This is exactly why I'm doing it. Thanks for joining me this week as we delve into so many life-affirming topics. I read an article recently by Sarah Elizabeth Richards in National Geographic that has really stuck with me. And I really want to focus in on this during this podcast. It's really stuck with me, and I think you're going to find out why. It was entitled, Why Our Minds Can't Make Sense of COVID-19's Enormous Death Toll. Although they were talking about the pandemic, what really resonated with me is that it similarly fits abortion and drives home some important points about how we cope with statistics, how we deal with losses that seem incalculable, how humanizing statistics, looking at the humanity behind something, really does make a difference. So let's take a dive into this article and in the midst of that, face some abortion statistics and stories together and ultimately talk about how we apply this to abortion. So here's how the article, Why Our Minds Can't Make Sense of COVID-19's Enormous Death Toll, begins. As someone who has made it my life's work to humanize statistics, I think they achieved their goal straight out of the gate. Here's how Ms. Richards begins the article. When the COVID-19 pandemic started 9 months ago, the current reported death tolls were unthinkable. Yet this week, the fatality count has reached 200,000 people in the United States, and global deaths are approaching 1 million. Although health officials say the real toll is likely much higher, due to a percentage of coronavirus deaths not being officially classified, the 200,000 statistic is a heartbreaking milestone. It's a symbolic, grim number that's seared into the public's consciousness and marks another alarming level of escalation in the pandemic. The tally means a U.S. death has happened every 1.5 minutes on average since the first official fatality in late February. It's also the equivalent of wiping out a small city, such as Salt Lake City, Utah, or Akron, Ohio, or a quarter of Washington, D.C. It means we've lost 1,450 plane loads full of people. If you think about it like that, assuming there are 138 seats in a classic 737, that would mean 8 planes have crashed on U.S. soil every day, says David Kessler, a Los Angeles-based grief specialist and the author of Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief. Can you imagine that? They raise the question. Can you even imagine that? I know it's hard, but you can imagine even more so. 61 million, really about 62 million, lives lost to abortion. Can you imagine that? Nearly 62 million lives lost to abortion in the United States over the past 47 years of legalized abortion. Nearly 62 million lives that we can even estimate. The number is likely much, much higher. Our population in the U.S. is approximately 328 million. So we've lost more than 1,450 plane loads of people. We've lost nearly a fifth of our population. The article goes on to talk about how our biology as humans works against us when it comes to making sense of big numbers. And this is what really struck me throughout the article. In the article, it says, researchers say our brains aren't wired to make sense of big numbers. We're also trying to digest coronavirus death tolls amid a sea of other worries, including economic uncertainty, civil unrest, wildfires, hurricanes, geopolitical strife, election tensions, and unprecedented shifts in how we work, shop, socialize, and educate our children. The whole country is depressed, says Elke Weber, a Princeton University cognitive psychologist. If you're already stressed out, that statistic of 200,000 becomes just another thing. I certainly wouldn't argue that as a country and really around the globe, the stress of the year, the incidence of depression and anxiety, it's unparalleled for our times. I understand that for many, the statistic can become just another thing. But how do we explain how 47 years worth of statistics about the lives lost from abortion has become just another thing? As the article points out, more tragedy doesn't always elicit more sympathy. I want to say that again. More tragedy doesn't always elicit more sympathy or more empathy. Paul Slovic, a psychologist at the University of Oregon, says it can counterintuitively bring about apathy. Interesting, right? More tragedy doesn't always elicit more empathy. It can counterintuitively bring about apathy due to a phenomenon he calls psychic numbing. I know many of you have probably heard of that before. I know that I have in my studies, and certainly I see it in the work that I do. So this is a part that I found super interesting, but not surprising. In a 2014 study that looked at charitable giving, Slovic found that people's concern for those in distress did not increase as the number of needy cases did. Slovic says our feelings are very strong for one person in danger, but they don't scale up very well. In other words, if there are two people, you don't feel twice as bad. Your attention gets divided, and you don't have as strong an emotional connection. In talking about the current state of our world, the article identifies that according to other experts, the long duration of the pandemic, combined with the absence of a clear end, can dull people's sense of shock. In other words, some brains just aren't even registering the numbers anymore. I know that's not surprising to people, but I found this to be a really interesting comparison by Weber again from Princeton. He said, if you think about people living in a war zone, the kind of thing that was once appalling becomes normal. Did you hear that? I want to say it again. The kind of thing that was once appalling becomes normal. Our brain neurons fire when something changes, but they stop after a while. If you're in a room with a bad smell, you eventually stop noticing it. After 47 years of legalized abortion, over 62 million lives lost, you eventually stop noticing the damage that abortion is causing. And of course, by and large, the victims of abortion are unnoticed, unreported, and if they dare survive and speak out, survivors like me, then you're targeted, shamed, discredited. How do you get a foothold into the truth as a survivor when the culture has been numb to the gravity of the problem, to the point that they silence and shame you? Honestly, that's why the Abortion Survivors Network exists, to not only provide help and hope to survivors, but to humanize the issue of abortion. The pro-life movement has worked hard to humanize the issue. Truth is on our side about human development. Ultrasound has provided a window to this truth, but survivors are the literal representation of humanizing abortion. There isn't some magical point in time when we suddenly became human. There's no magical time when abortion would have been better for us. We are the individuals who had our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness denied. Is it really any wonder that so many people don't know how to respond to survivors or how to support us? We really are a shock to the system for many, even within the pro-life movement. For brains that have been numb to the magnitude of deaths by abortion, when you come face to face with one survivor, nonetheless hundreds, you have a lot to face and overcome. I know this is a lot of heavy content for a podcast where we're already dealing with a lot of heaviness in the world, right? Uh, I don't know what else to say. I almost feel guilty, right, with how heavy this is, but I think we have to unpack this, right? I mean, I know we have a lot of heaviness in our world, and I promise my next podcast I'll bring in somebody and make it a really encouraging, lively, upbeat conversation. But I think we need to unpack what we see happening in our world, right? And apply it to what has happened in the last 47 years of legalized abortion. So let's get back to what that National Geographic article talks about. The next quote they talk about that I really pulled from this article was from an associate professor at the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. The name of the professor is Yu-Ru Lin. And this professor has documented people's emotional reactions on social media to short-term and shocking, in their words, events or natural disasters, including a study about the 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris. This researcher, this associate professor, she found that being able to express a surge of emotions after a defined event helped people to cope. Not surprising, right? I think we all have seen it in our world of social media. They said, viral memes that often circulate on social media, on the internet, following certain tragedies can spark emotional responses that resonate. Like the horrific image, I remember this, maybe you will too. The horrific image of a Syrian refugee toddler who washed ashore on a Turkish beach in 2015. I remember it. And in this study, right, they found that this viral image led to record donations to help victims of Syria's civil war. So we know this, that those images resonate with people. In Lynn's study, she found that having an actual place to go where the tragedy occurred and perhaps even bring flowers or other items to it, that's been found to be a key in processing grief. I mean, why do we see that, right? When people memorialize a location for even someone famous, right? Their passing, it's a way of processing grief. I get it. Lynn went on and said, when I studied the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, people had gatherings and ceremonies after the event and would even have an anniversary event to remember those losses. Yeah, absolutely. I remember. We see it in our world today. I mean, even though it looks different because of the pandemic, right? But we know what it's like for people to be able to process their grief in a very tangible way. But let's connect it back to abortion. September 12th was the National Day of Remembrance for Aborted Children. Many people probably don't know that, but that's a specific anniversary we have. Services were offered, flowers were laid in remembrance for aborted children at sites across the United States. You probably don't know this, but now you do. The National Memorial for the Unborn is located in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I want to go there someday. There's even a virtual wall that you can access at memorialfortheunborn.org. And I want to talk about this because these sites are important, because they do give us that tangible place to go and process our grief over the pain of abortion. I saw a photo recently, and I can't remember what country it was happening in. I think it was Eastern Europe somewhere. Somebody can send me a comment if I'm wrong. Maybe you'll remember it too. But a sculptor there, had sculptures of babies representing the lives lost to abortion. They had them laid out on the sidewalks or the square of a city. I mean, you could not miss them. And I posted it on social media because I kept thinking about what it would look like to have sculptures of 62 million lives lost in the United States alone. I mean, think about that. We wouldn't be able to stay numb over the magnitude of this loss when we are literally tripping over the sculptures that are reflective of those lives lost. It's powerful. This National Geographic article, though, it goes on from there to really decry the fact that people don't have a way to process their long-haul grief. They talk about how no memorials have been built right now. Social distancing has prevented a grief ritual from taking place. And my heart goes out to people. I mean, I know people who have lost their lives to COVID, and I know it's impacted even people's ability to hold a memorial service, right, safely, or following guidelines in their city or state. So I know that there are obstacles to processing long-haul grief right now. But, you know, it begs the question for me, how do we process our long-haul grief over abortion when there is no end in sight? You know, in the pandemic, we're talking about, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, when is life going to go back to normal? But with abortion, we don't have any endpoint. I live every day hoping the endpoint is tomorrow, right? Like, I want to wake up and have put myself out of a job. I've got lots of things I would love to do to still help heal and minister to people, but there is no end in sight for this. So how do we process our long-haul grief over abortion with no end in sight? I'll tell you what I think. You tell me later what you think. I think survivors are such an important piece of this puzzle to processing that long-haul grief. Yes, we are the literal representation of tens of millions of lives lost, which is absolutely heartbreaking. But we're also a sign of hope. We're a sign of hope that good can come in the midst of incredible pain and loss. And I just posted about this recently on social media too. That's something that frustrates me to no end about the abortion industry and the media and the politicians who deny the existence of survivors. Not only are they denying truth that is documented over decades, but they're also denying people of this hope. In the words of this article, they're denying people the opportunity to process their long-haul grief. I truly believe that. We talk a lot about denial when it comes to the abortion issue. I mean, the truth about failed abortions and survivors is denied repeatedly by many people. And there are lots of factors that impact this, as we've already talked about, including the success of the media, the abortion industry, and their lobby in perpetuating lies. But I think we need to also talk about how common it is to simply deny thoughts that are unpleasant. How common it is to just shut them out. Maybe it's the mom in me, but I can really just picture in my head my kids plugging their ears shut, jabbering, "I can't hear you," right? "I can't hear you." When one of them is saying something to the other that they don't want to hear, or maybe it's me. I'm not alone in that, am I? I know we all have somebody that plugs our ears about that. And we know the same is to be true for even adults. Abortion is an unpleasant issue. Failed abortions, the survivors, the need for born alive legislation. It's really unpleasant to think about, to hear about, to talk about. But somehow we have to find a way to break through the horror, the unpleasantness, the denial, to share these important truths about it all. And again, I think that's where we're at with the Abortion Survivors Network. And, that's certainly a goal in the pro-life movement, to break through that denial with truth, with love, with healing. I was just talking with Lisa Rowe of Support After Abortion about this the other day. We have to change generational patterns of abortion and secrets in order to bring about a lasting cultural change. I truly believe that. We have to change generational patterns of abortion and the secrets that exist in order to bring about a lasting cultural change. But to get back to the article, emotional checking out, as we can call it, calms us down. I thought this was interesting. I mean, again, it's not surprising, right? But Marty Horowitz, a psychiatrist at the University of California, San Francisco, is quoted as saying that in the article. Emotional checking out calms us down. Horowitz studies grief and trauma, and I get it. The way I often describe it to people, what it's like to be a survivor and an activist in the pro-life movement, is that once you know the truth, there is no going back. As hard as the work is that I do some days, once you check in emotionally, once you know the truth, you can't just flip that switch off easily. So I get it. Back to the article again, though. The next point was so impactful to me. Again, it's not a new or surprising concept, but it was such a confirmation to me of what we're working with. Author Sarah Richards, in talking about the pandemic, reflects upon how most people in the United States haven't yet experienced the loss of a loved one. And that makes a big and grave number feel more remote. Essentially, it's the, until it affects you or someone you know kind of thing, it doesn't seem like such a big deal. I'll be honest. Even though my intent in this podcast isn't to talk about the pandemic, I can tell you I know more people than I can begin to count who have had it. Yes, I know many, many people who have also died from it. This is not an ambiguous concept to me. I know that COVID has ended so many people's lives. It's not ambiguous to me. But I do understand how it could be ambiguous for so many people. But how do we relate that back to abortion? How do we make abortion unthinkable? Well, we connect the dots for people. We illustrate for them how it does affect them or someone they know. And not just in the, I love someone who's had an abortion kind of way that we see from time to time as campaigns, but also in that I love someone who survived an abortion way. Until people come face to face, name to name, life to life with someone directly impacted by something like abortion, they may not get it. They may not get it. And I posted about this recently on social media. I don't know how many of you saw it. I posted about a friend's really classic response to an election text. I won't name the state, I won't name the candidate, but it is funny. We'll just say the circumstances were interesting. But this friend of mine, God bless her, I thought it was great. She had received this text from this Democratic candidate talking about, are you going to support this candidate? Da 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 da. And she, of course, posed the question, right? Well, where do they stand on the issue of a woman's right to choose abortion, right? She said something like that. Her wording was very, very specific and well thought out. And, the campaign staffer did their kind of typical reply of, they believe in, the tenets of Roe and, this really canned, gray talking point response. And my friend responded, I have a number of friends who survived abortions. And, raised the question, what about them? Googled the name of Melissa Ohden, the Abortion Survivors Network. What about her rights? And it took a while. Of course, it took a while before that campaign staffer ended up sending a text back. And I think her response was something to the extent of, thank you for sharing that with me, multiple exclamation points, right? I'm sure she had to dig kind of deep in the how to respond to this and not be offensive kind of playbook. But, I thought that was fantastic because not only does it plant a seed in that person who maybe didn't have truth, but it humanizes things, right? It takes it from this really ambiguous concept to a very specific issue that has impacted someone. So I love that. And certainly feel free to take that concept and run with it, right? Get an election text, respond like that, and let me know how it goes. I want to start tracking these outcomes, right? Super exciting. So that was kind of my experience with that. But to get back to the article, in another, interesting but not surprising analysis, a researcher included in this National Geographic article talked about her research into people's responses um, to, all of these events. And, it was really her analysis that people express a surge of emotions. We know this, right? But she talked about being able to express that surge of emotions after that event is what helped people to cope. And I know it kind of goes back to that long haul grief and having a tangible place to process that grief. But I want to raise that question again, because it's not just, long haul grief, but it's how do we routinely express a surge of emotions that help us cope? How do we cope with the grief and loss of abortion when we live in a culture that defines it as a choice and a right? How do we express our emotions when we keep abortion a secret in families and relationships? How do we ever cope when our culture isn't supportive of any expression of emotion other than a simple acceptance of it as a norm? I can tell you I'm really thrilled to be talking about these very issues soon in an upcoming virtual healing conference with support after abortion. More to come about that soon, but for now, I just want to raise those questions for you to mull over. Culturally, not only do we have a problem with abortion, but we have a problem with coping with the pain of abortion. So I don't think anybody would argue the fact, right, that culturally we do have a problem with abortion, and we also simultaneously have a problem with coping with the pain of abortion. But this is where the article talked about some interesting pieces, and I'll, try to keep it, I'll try to keep it brief. We'll just put it that way, right? Now you're thinking, oh my goodness, Melissa, what are you going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about the use of images again, right? This article already talked a little bit about that horrific image of the Syrian refugee toddler, right? The one that I still remember, the one that you likely might remember. And how that viral image really can spark an emotional response that resonates with people. But as we're talking about coping with the pain of abortion and the use of images that resonate with people, for me, it kind of points us back to where we typically find ourselves at a crossroad in the pro-life movement. The use of what we would say graphic images. And I think I've talked about this stance before that I have on this in previous podcasts. But for those of you who aren't aware, I support the use of graphic images. So, graphic, i.e. an aborted child, right? The abortion procedure. I do support the use of graphic images in places like college campuses, but with very important caveats, right? Because I know the magnitude of people who have suffered or directly been affected by abortion. I support the use of those images with trigger warnings clearly there, right? Giving people that option, knowing that it's there to look at. And having care available for people, right? I mean, I've been negatively impacted by graphic images. Trust me, I still am today. It triggers my trauma in a huge way. So, as this article talks about, how do we cope and how do we deal with long haul grief and how do we, effectively help people understand the gravity of loss? I get it. I get where images come into that, but we do have this definite conflict in the pro-life movement about the use of graphic images. But, I want to talk about this because, again, I think this is where survivors come in. Whereas graphic images can really be too much for some people to handle. The face and the life of a survivor is a not so graphic image, right? That still humanizes the otherwise ambiguous nature of abortion. It shows us what the statistic of abortion really looks like. Here in the month of October, we put out some really great social media images. If you haven't seen it yet, we just started sharing them. They're images of abortion survivors. Most of the time it's going to have a baby photo, but some survivors don't even have baby photos. We're going to talk about that more some other time because there's a lot behind that. But it shows the image, right, of them as a baby or a young child that says me. And then a picture of them as an adult that says, still me, right? That humanizes people. It shows them what the statistic of abortion really looks like. So back to the article, in the National Geographic article, that psychologist, Marty Horowitz, or psychologist, sorry, goes on in the article to talk about how important it is to acknowledge feelings of indignation, hopelessness, and despair, and then move through them. I think that's really important, the moving through them. Horowitz says we have to strive for the middle ground in these extremes. It makes people feel better and restores our collective goals. Again, connecting this back to abortion, people need to be able to acknowledge their feelings and then move through them. Culturally, there are obstacles to this when abortion is normalized and championed. That falls on us. It falls on us, you guys, people who know the truth about abortion, to have these sometimes difficult and painful conversations with people, but that ultimately allow people to process through them. And I love this next point so much. The article identifies that the best way to avoid compassion fatigue is to think of individuals with faces, names, and families. The best way to avoid compassion fatigue is to think of individuals with faces, names, and families. Someone once observed, statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. Man, I love that. Statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. Not surprisingly, a researcher, once again it's Slovak, that's identified in the article, found that people were more likely to donate to needy children when they saw photos and learned more about their circumstances. I mean, obviously we know this. We've seen the commercials. You're thinking about that Sarah McLachlan song right now, aren't you? You know, that song that they play for animals in need. I know it's just not me. It's not just me thinking about it right now. And as hard as it is for survivors to share their stories, their faces even with the world, we know that humanizing the unborn is a key to preventing the suffering that we ourselves have experienced. We know this. This is why survivors sacrifice so much, why we put up with so much, because we know there's no other way. There's no other way to get the point across, not in the way that we need to. The article then closes by talking about how we can find meaning in the midst of grief. David Kessler, that author of Finding Meaning that I talked about earlier, states people are hitting the wall. People are hitting the wall because we're talking about these deaths in every other way except loss. Oh, this is so powerful to me. He says it's a political device or a medical crisis or a mask debate. We're not talking about it as Juan's mother or Susan's brother. Relatable, I mean, wow, totally relatable. As I've been known to say, survivors are not a myth. We're not a political stunt. We're not a controversial issue. We are human beings just like you who have suffered immeasurably. Kessler says that a healthy coping mechanism is to use personal connections to motivate positive change. That one's important to me. And you can do this, right? You know the names of survivors. You know our stories. Share them. Go to our website. Share information. Plant the seed within someone that there is more to this quote unquote issue than what they've ever known. Take Mr. Kessler's advice. He closes this article by stating, our limited capacity and our desire to avoid uncomfortable feelings shouldn't allow us to disengage. In fact, he argues that numbness can fuel much needed action. I agree. Kessler states in this article, when I visited the death camps at Auschwitz, I saw the shoes and the glasses of the people who died, and it made me numb. But when I left, I said to my numbness, what can I do to prevent this? Kessler says numbness should not let us off the hook. I absolutely agree. And that's the question that I leave you with today as I end this podcast. The question that drives my daily work. What can I do to prevent this, the devastation of abortion? I can't wait to hear from you about your answer. What can you do to prevent the devastation of abortion? Let me know. Thanks for joining me this week on Life Empowers. I hope you found our time together to be life-affirming, hope-building, encouraging, informative. And remember, the next time someone states that abortion is empowering, you know better. Life empowers. See you again next week.